On July 6, 2018, Angela Hernandez woke up and found herself trapped inside her SUV, which was floating in the Pacific Ocean. She didn't remember how she got there or what had happened. Angela would spend the next 7 days clinging to her life. On that same day, just a few minutes before, Angela was driving along the California Coast Highway heading south. It was a relatively pleasant day, and her journey was leisurely with beautiful ocean views. She remembered most of the trip up until the moment she saw an animal running onto the road. Her instant reaction was to swerve, but as she tried to regain control, her SUV skidded off the cliff edge, plummeting 200 feet down before crashing into the rocky shoreline and then into the sea. After some time unconscious, Angela woke up, realizing she was still inside the car and could feel water rising up to her knees. She looked around and saw the electricity in her car was out and the windows were closed. Quickly, Angela grabbed a multi-tool from her side and began hitting it against the window. Every bone in her body felt immense pain, but even then, she didn't realize the extent of her injuries. When she finally broke the window, she pulled herself out and swam to the rocky shore where she immediately passed out. When Angela woke up, it was still daytime, and she began to realize the situation she was in. The cliff where she had fallen was not in a high-traffic area, but rather an isolated rocky beach with no way to climb the steep terrain. The cliff seemed to continue endlessly as far as she could see. In the distance, she saw her SUV stranded on the rocks with its roof torn off. Despite its dire condition, Angela started walking along the rocks to seek help, wearing nothing but socks. She could hear cars passing on the road above, but she was too far for anyone on the road to see her, and the road was too loud for anyone to hear her screams. She slept on the rocks due to hunger, thirst, and sunburn, and the next day authorities were alerted. Angela's whereabouts were unknown, and a small search team was sent to look for her. They got confirmation of Angela driving her SUV on the highway the day before, so that's where they started their search. Unfortunately, thick fog from the coast persisted for several days, making it nearly impossible for the rescue team to locate her or the wreckage. However, right beneath them, 200 feet below, Angela struggled for her life in critical condition. She spent the next 6 days using a hose she salvaged from her car to catch dripping water from the mossy rocks on the cliffside, while only getting a few drops at a time. All of this was counted in the situation. During these few days, she helplessly watched from the rocks as cars passed right near her on the highway. On Friday the 13th, Chad and Chelsea, a married couple, were walking along the beach exploring the area, which had never been visited by anyone. At some point in the afternoon, one of the hikers saw a car bumper floating along the shore. As they approached, they saw the crash site. The SUV was completely destroyed, and they had no idea how long it had been there. They saw no signs of anyone. Convinced that anyone inside the vehicle wouldn't have survived and likely been swept into the sea, Chelsea persuaded her husband to check the bodies in the area just to make sure. In their search, she spotted a woman among some partially submerged rocks. They both ran to Angela, giving her water and asking for help. First responders quickly arrived, rappelling down the cliff with ropes to treat her injuries before hoisting her back up and taking her to the hospital. At the time of her rescue, Angela suffered from brain bleeding, a broken collarbone and ribs, collapsed lungs, and other injuries. Fortunately, Angela was able to make a full recovery after the incident. Jimmy Hale was a relatively wealthy man living in Massachusetts in the early 1900s. In 1928, he began developing an interest in archaeology and fossils. After reading books on bushcraft and archaeology, he traveled to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas without hesitation, despite Mr. Hale lacking much preparation, considering himself an expert after a brief introduction through several books. Upon arrival, he hired a local landlord to provide him with temporary accommodation along with some guidance in the mountains. This individual was Vance Randolph, an experienced artifact hunter in the Ozark region, which was a common area for prehistoric archaeology. Vance stated that in the days leading up to their expedition, Mr. Hale felt very confident that he would even try to correct Vance based on his knowledge over the years. Despite starting their journey, they set up a small camp along their trail where they would stay and attempt to find artifacts and fossils. After 2 weeks of traveling across the Ozark Mountains, according to Vance, they were only 3 to 4 miles from the nearest village. On this morning at the camp, Mr. Hale decided he wanted to find this village so he could make a call to his girlfriend back home. He planned to walk to the small village and return a few hours before sunset. Vance stated that the road to the village was straight and safe and allowed Mr. Hale to go. Vance took this as a break from dealing with Mr. Hale's annoying arrogance and confidence. But when the sun began to set, Mr. Hale had not returned yet. The companions still couldn't believe Mr. Hale could get lost in the woods during the short trip, and instead believed he must have decided to stay overnight in the village. Vance waited for a while, then slept alone in the camp. In the morning, he waited until noon before realizing Mr. Hale should have been back by then. Vance went to the village and found no trace of Mr. Hale having been there the night before, which meant he had never made it to the village. More worried than ever, Vance enlisted the help of a local woodcutter named Lem, who knew the area even better than Vance himself. After just an hour of searching, they found a small cave. It was only 2 miles from their camp, and inside they found some of Mr. Hale's backpack belongings, confirming that he had slept there the previous night. The cave entrance was quite far from the village trail, which only made them more unsure of Mr. Hale's condition. Lem and Vance continued climbing the mountain towards the camp, thinking he must be trying to return. Not long after they saw Mr. Hale, when Vince approached him, Mr. Hale shook his head and waved his hand wildly. When Vance called to him, he turned and stared as if threatened. He then attacked Vance, foaming at the mouth and spitting with rage in his eyes. Vance ran and ducked behind bushes, using them to keep a distance from Mr. Hale as they circled him. After a short chase, Mr. Hale ran in the opposite direction, completely off the trail and into the dense forest. Lem followed his tracks and soon found Mr. Hale lying face down on the snow-covered ground. They approached cautiously, but found Mr. Hale completely unresponsive. Lem helped Vance carry Mr. Hale's limp body back to the village, where Lem kindly allowed him to stay overnight. The next morning, Mr. Hale finally woke up when questioned. He seemed confused and stated that he only remembered a few things he said, which were being lost and crossing his own trail, then suddenly becoming very scared and running into the woods. That's all he could remember from the days before. He didn't remember what made him afraid or why he acted so aggressively. When Mr. Hale was better, he was sent home to Massachusetts. Whatever happened to Mr. Hale on his expedition in the Ozark Mountains is still unknown. In 2010, Edward Rosenthal embarked on a small journey into the remote desert of Southern California. Unbeknownst to him, Rosenthal would spend the next 6 days and walk a total of 39 kilometers completely lost in the vast and scorching sand desert canyons without any food or water. Edward Rosenthal was a true poet, a real estate broker, and an experienced hiker at the age of 64. He even kept a personal journal with records of his lifelong hikes. In 2010, Rosenthal contributed to a large-scale real estate sale in downtown Los Angeles, and to celebrate this significant achievement, he decided to take a trip to Joshua Tree National Park in California to spend a few days camping and hiking. Rosenthal stayed at the nearest hotel, and on Friday morning, he went to Black Rock Campground where he would talk to some campers who were also staying there, and then embark on a short day-long journey into the canyons. He brought a framed hiking hat, 3 liters of water, some light snacks, a small blanket, a whistle, and some matches. Considering the small trail he followed, Rosenthal was actually well prepared. He managed to reach the end of the trail in just 1 minute. However, hours later, when he started walking back along the same trail, it's worth noting that the desert landscape often looked very bare, sometimes appearing almost the same in every direction. Without being too cautious, it would be very easy to think you were on the same trail when you were actually on a completely different one. Rosenthal remained on the right trail for a while, but after not recognizing some areas, he eventually realized he had lost the trail. He wasn't sure he could trace his way back to the trail given the unfamiliar landscape, and worried about getting more lost with little choice. Rosenthal took a turn in what he thought would intersect with the main trail, but unfortunately this only led him further away from the safe place he had hiked for almost 1.5 days, walking 2,000 feet along the canyon before he ran out of all his food and water. Rosenthal knew his situation was dire, and he needed to find shelter. While he had never been in such a situation before, he knew that blindly hiking across the desert would only shorten his time before experiencing severe dehydration. He found a small ravine along the canyon, which provided a small area for shelter. He tried using his matches, but they failed to light up after trying to shout with his whistle for several hours. Rosenthal sat leaning against the canyon wall and waited. He would stay in the same place for another 4 days. Now, Rosenthal had been lost in the desert for a total of 5 full days, hungry, severely dehydrated, and losing hope during the days he spent sitting. On the side of the ravine, there were no signs of rescue in sight. Worried he wouldn't make it, Rosenthal took off his hat and pulled out a pen from his pocket on the edge of his hat. He wrote a message to his wife and daughter, telling them how much he loved them, and he didn't want his funeral to be sad. He wanted them to celebrate his life rather than mourn his death. He finished writing what he believed to be his final farewell message, then put his hat back on and rested his eyes. What Rosenthal didn't know was that on Saturday afternoon, at the same time he sat on the edge of the ravine, the hotel where he checked in realized he hadn't returned shortly after a camper at Black Rock Campground also noticed his car still at the trailhead. Authorities were alerted, and a search began on Sunday, 2 days after Rosenthal took the wrong turn. 60 rescue teams surveyed the area around the trail that Rosenthal was said to have taken. They used a helicopter, ground search team, and search dogs. On the 3rd day, they found a series of tracks they believed to be Rosenthal's, and followed them down the canyon until they reached the ravine where they lost the tracks. It was the same ravine where Rosenthal took the wrong turn, and right on the other side, Rosenthal wrote his farewell message on the edge of the ravine from his hat. The ground search team informed the helicopter air patrol, and on Thursday morning, Rosenthal was spotted by the helicopter sitting on the canyon wall, waving a shiny reflective cloth towards the pilot. Rosenthal was rescued after 6 days lost in the desert. He was treated at the nearest hospital and made a full recovery. Rosenthal's decision to stop walking and wait for rescue greatly contributed to his survival by conserving as much water and energy as possible. After returning home safely with his family, Rosenthal wrote one final entry in his hiking journal saying, "I'm still here.